reactable, and Joseph Anderson was prophetic and correct, and the video aged like wine and stands the test of time, and so on. I'd say it's my favorite feeling, but it happens so often that I'm mostly used to it by now. Mostly. So I sipped on Twitter in celebration and thought that'd be the end of it. For the first time in my life, I was wrong. The comments kept coming, then emails, then Twitter DMs, Reddit DMs, the worst kind. People started stopping me in the street to tell me how right I was and that they were sorry they hadn't seen how bad it had gotten. My kids keep asking me why so many people want to shake my hand, and so I decided I had to see for myself before From had a chance to patch the game out of the mess they had made. I wanted the raw, horrifically awful, base experience of Shadow of the Erdtree. Not for my own enjoyment, because let's be real, I don't enjoy anything about these games, and I never have, and not even to make a video. I just wanted to bask in the warm glory of being right. So I downloaded the expansion and unplugged my Ethernet cord so that day one train wreck could live on for my whole playthrough, crashing over and over. Having finished the DLC now, I can objectively say that FromSoft has hit a new low, and they were already pretty far down, so this is like breaking into Ash Lake after thinking the boss design Blighttown was rock bottom in the base game. How I long for that FromSoft to return now, because what we have to tolerate today is a shadow of its former self. I'd say they've lost the plot, if their games had any. They've painted themselves into a corner now since deciding they live in a world without criticism. The DLC's design is soulless and hollow, the series has been wrung out, and whoever is in charge is an old king overdue to be put out to field. But they won't. They'll stick around until all the blood is bored out of the fans, too afraid to speak up, and will inevitably die twice. Once now, as the actually astute among us notice the decline and will be ignored, and a second time when you all finally catch up to us and realize that this was the moment of downfall. And if you had only been brave enough to admit to some shortcomings, then things could have been different. But now there's only ashes left to watch flow away. Demon Souls, I didn't want to make this video, but I can't resist rubbing it in. I will now proceed to relentlessly complain about every single thing wrong in this DLC, which is a lot, for the next 70 minutes. I will also provide the easily impressionable masses with the correct opinion, my opinion, which will from this day forward be parroted on every message board as fact about this game's quality, and in 100 other videos, all with a variant of broken masterpiece in the title. Just to annoy you, specifically, and this is your fault, because I warned you, if you try to block me, you can only make me stronger. Father Garrett, forgive me. This is Phase 2. Alright, so that should have gone on long enough to scare off the type of people it was making fun of. Let's begin for real. Spoilers for Elden Ring and all of the DLC, of course. 2 years ago, I made that critique video, and it was probably the best received of the big ones that I've ever done. You know, the videos where I give credit to the big latest release for being great, but also don't shy away from a good chunk of what I think is legitimate criticism, like Breath of the Wild, God of War, Mario Odyssey. Usually this type of content triggers a big backlash counterattack, even though it wasn't my intention to attack anything or anybody. But I get it, truly, I can come across as really negative sometimes, often more than I actually am, and people love their video games. I do too, we're passionate, it's fine. The Elden Ring critique wasn't like that. It followed an inversion of the usual response. Most people today are more willing to admit the shortcomings in Breath of the Wild and Odyssey, for example, whereas they were frothingly adamant that the games were flawless at release. Meanwhile, most people agreed with my Elden Ring video when it came out. Gonna get a bunch of comments about that, but I'm sorry, it's true, they really did, it got a lot of support, but over time, some of them have returned to say they no longer do so. Said another way, the fanbase at large seemed to agree with most of my criticism near release, and a significant portion of them have since gradually shifted conclusions to that the problems they thought were in the game aren't that big of a deal anymore, or don't exist at all and never did, and they had to play the game some more to figure it out, or are the player's faults, or maybe even my fault, not the game's. My first video, like most things that are created, has a few mistakes in it. I'm going to talk more about them and the response it has gotten toward the end of this one, but considering how infamous that critique has become in some circles, it didn't feel right to begin here without acknowledging that. The fake intro also wasn't a complete lie because I really wasn't going to play this expansion at release until the torrent change news exposed me to so many comments complaining about the DLC's boss design and how much From had doubled down on all of the issues I had pointed out in the base game. In fact, I haven't played a proper video game since December, I think. It piqued my curiosity too much to ignore, and then I really did want to play the initial launch version of these fights to see what all the fuss was about after that. And this is where things might get a touch awkward because I know exactly what some people are expecting from me here. Validation about those issues, biting criticism about how the fights are too hard and have strayed too far from the fundamentals of punishing but always fair, in an attempt to still provide a difficult, rewarding experience to a player base that has an incredible amount of banked mastery and improvement by now, gained from the previous games that are like this: Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Souls-like imitators, and so on. Sorry, you know what I'm talking about if you're still listening. This is a waste of time. It really pains me to do this. The FromSoft player base has become the absolute worst fan group in video games since the release of Elden Ring. Just the most incessantly obnoxious group of people that feel like they're defending an insulted family member when you say the slightest word wrong in the proximity of their beloved video game. They speak like a Pokemon named Get Good that evolves into a skill issue, so I know full well how much shit I'm going to get for this in the long term, but I have enough history with these games that I feel compelled to do it anyway. I feel like I owe it in some way, since this series is what I launched my channel with. I loved Shadow of the Erdtree. I think it's a big step in the right direction from vanilla Elden Ring and has been a huge relief for me to go through. While there is undoubtedly some unfairness in some of the fights and many problems in the exploration and the world, I had a blast overall, and I was sad when it ended. Dare I say it, I had a yabba dabba do time, and I wouldn't be bothering to make this video right now if I hadn't. I think this is the best DLC FromSoft has made, because Sekiro didn't get one. Now, having made that comparison with the DLC from the other games, I must rush to point out the price difference. 40 USD is a steal for this in my opinion, but it is still so much more than the previous DLC packs and closer to a full price game. So it's a little rough to compare. The best one to put next to it is, unexpectedly, all 3 of the individual editions Dark Souls 2 got viewed as a combined package. Next would be doing the same for the Duo DLC that Dark Souls 3 received. Even when doing that, I still think Shadow of the Erdtree comes out on top. If Old Hunters or Artorias of the Abyss were twice as big and twice as expensive and kept the quality up the whole entire time, then maybe that wouldn't be true. Yeah, sorry, I wonder if it's a new group of people that hate me now. How dare I? So does that mean the Shattered Masterpiece has been repaired, reforged? It crushed a rune arc. Take down all those YouTube videos with all those titles. Am I back on the Elden Ring train? Choo-choo. What about my thoughts on the base game? Well, it's a bit complicated. I don't think it's true that I have mixed feelings on most of these games anymore. My view has matured to being strongly positive, with some clear flaws that I know exist and wish weren't there, but I still adore the games. For example, Dark Souls 1 is an amazing work of art and one of my favorite games of all time, but everything after Big ONS makes me want to quit, and I have, and do, quit at that exact spot on so many playthroughs. The DLC can become an alternate end path for that game since the quality is so high, and eerily I wonder if that's what's going to happen to Elden Ring for me from now on. However, there are other problems that are on this level that I want to get into, but I also want to try my best to avoid the whole, oh my god, best game ever, here are 20 reasons why it sucks script style that I can fall into. And having finished the script now, and I'm recording this part much later, I feel like I kind of fell into that trap again, but you know, let's let it ride and see what happens. I played the entire base game again on a fresh character for Shadow of the Erdtree. Even though it's not my favorite, I went with a double Colossal Sword build because the slow weapon speed was an issue I had before, and I thought it would be a good test to use that same approach in the DLC. So no summons, no magic, no ash spirits, just me, my weapons, and the boss. Those weapons had also apparently been buffed a few times, in particular for recovery times after swinging them since I last played, and I wanted to see how that felt. It took me about 50 hours to go through all of the base game zones, side dungeons, legacy dungeons, and bosses. I tried to sort of emulate a blind first playthrough and did most of the content again. I didn't do any grinding. In fact, I got a little impatient and ran through a couple of zones toward the end, and I was level 158 when I got to the new content. This feels about right since you can't access it without getting to near the end of the game. It took me 40 hours to beat the DLC, 5 hours of which were spent just on the final boss, which means he takes the crown as the longest I've ever spent trying to beat a fight in one of these games. It also means the DLC all on its own is comparable in length to some full-release Souls-likes, and that's pretty awesome. I don't know if this is going to be worthwhile, but here's the path I took in the DLC as a reference, since it's so non-linear and can be approached in many different ways. That's Elden Ring for you. Hopefully it's interesting at least, and if you don't think so, you can just skip to the next chapter in the timeline below. I explored the starting area a little bit, killed the first Furnace Golem, and then went straight into the Legacy Dungeon Belarus. I didn't intend to stay long, but I ended up getting sucked into completing it right then. I was at Scatty Fragment level 2 and killed the Dancing Lion in a little under half an hour. I found it quite difficult. Afterwards, I finished exploring the starting area, did my first side content in a jail and side dungeon, and crossed the bridge toward Castle Ensis. I decided to keep exploring, however, and went down the other roads first. I found the alternative way to Scadu Altus through the Spirit Springs, landing you in a different castle. I killed the mini-boss there and found the route to the new zone, but I felt like I had skipped too much of the earlier areas to push into this one, and I didn't want a repeat of what happened to me in base Elden Ring, so I went back to the Graveside Plain. This play session ended with me finding Egon on the ground, cursing some other guy named Bale. How curious. That joke doesn't make sense, because that's from the Witcher 3 script, although he won't give you any specifics about how long it's been. How curious. Non-linear joke, enjoy. Next up was a spot of Civil War when I had to kill a fellow old dragon man and found my way, surprisingly through a side dungeon, at a new zone, Jagged Peak. There were a few dragons to kill here, although I skipped Senesax because fuck that noise, and a thrilling horseback mountain climb to Bale, who turns out to also be a dragon. I was Scooby Snack level 5 and tried for over an hour to kill him until this happened to me. Twice. This, combined with my damage feeling a bit low, annoyed me enough to make like I was its importance and roll up the rim out of there. I did try some of the new Colossal Katana weapons for a bit here though, and thought they were fun too. I was now obsessed with finding the map stone just to the north of this area, so I kept exploring and couldn't find it. I ended up in Cerulean and Charos, finding a sealed doorway at the bottom of a deep chasm, riding through the Finger Ruins down here, which were a big disappointment, thumbs down from me, and then returned to Gravesite Plain to mop up some points of interest before finally heading into Castle Ensis proper. I was Scadu level 6 for Rolana, and again it was a pretty difficult boss that took just under half an hour like the Lion. Scadu Altus was next, and I did a pretty half-assed circuit of exploration, including a detour to the ancient ruins of Ra'a via the imbued sword key teleporter before my first foray into Shadow Keep. I was Scadu 7 for Golden Hippo, and it only took a couple of attempts, probably because I had already fought one as a roaming mini-boss in the southern part of the map. If you played the game, then you know Shadowkeep is quite a large area with many sublocations. I went through the courtyard-like bit after the hippo fight and found the secret way out to the flooded subzone of Altus. I followed this mostly linear path for 2 more hippo kills and a lengthy catacombs-type dungeon that surprisingly ended with a meatier-than-usual boss named Jory. The Abyssal Woods is gated behind this fight, unless there's another way here that I didn't find, and that was an even bigger surprise. I went through a bit of it right then and finally got the map stone I couldn't reach before. I wanted to unveil the entire map now, so I went back to Shadowkeep and took the westward route through a dungeon wing and across a bridge to the ancient ruins of Ra'a. I ended up clearing most of this zone, looking for a way to the map pillar thing, and not finding it. My skedaddle power reached double digits here, being 11 for the boss Ramana of the Bud dude, and this was the only main fight of the DLC that I killed on my first try. For some reason after this, I gave up on my Mapstone quest and went back to the Abyssal Woods. I reached Midra's Manse shortly thereafter and spent 40 minutes fighting Midra himself before finally winning, which is weird because I think the Lion and Rolana are way more difficult than him. I must have kept getting caught out by some of his damaging spells, I guess, or something like that. I was still tree power 11 for this boss. In between this play session and the next, one of the creaky wheels in my head finally squeaked out a thought, and I wondered if the broken seal in that weird message that appeared when I approached Shadowkeep was referring to the door in the chasm I found earlier in the Cerulean coast. This turned out to be correct. It was a surprise to me too, so I did that literal dungeon dive next. My Scadu amp still went to 11 for the boss here, but I began to wonder about the balancing implications of it when I absolutely melted the Putrescent Knight on my 4th attempt. I liked this boss a lot more when I fought it a second time with just a longsword and got to see its mechanics. I returned to Cerulean next to explore it more thoroughly, and then did the same for Scadu Altus right after. I did some side dungeons and found a path through a cave that led to the land at the base of Ra'a and where the Trolley Mapstone was located. With the map finally complete, I first admired the big tree at the top of it looks gorgeous, and then spent half an hour bamboozled into hitting every wall around this elevated township, and trying every angle to double jump over with torrents because a message nearby was telling me there had to be a way in somehow. I finally did get in, only to immediately, and I do mean immediately, find the hole in the wall I was meant to use when I landed on the other side. I regretted not streaming my playthrough in this moment. Sorry, chat. Would have been a good clip. A quick teleport later, fully exploring Shadowkeep was finally happening, or so I thought, because it had a whole other entrance and area I hadn't found yet, so I spent a ton of time trying to figure out how to get to this ladder before giving up. I even found a glitch in an invisible wall that stops you from getting through here even if you can make the jump. Good job there, From. By the time I got to Mesmer, I was Shadow Blessing 15, but was still embraced in his flame for 35 minutes. Quite difficult. This was my second favorite fight of the DLC. I wonder if everyone knows what my favorite fight is now, having just said that. Somehow I missed one of the gaping holes in that ruined village in Altus, so I spent more time than I care to admit trying to find the way down to this area of the map before noticing this well with a ladder and thinking, well, there must be a tunnel, and stumbling on the way forward nearby. I rode through this area, couldn't be bothered killing the armored leg furnace golem again, met the Finger Ruins guy at the church, and found the second entrance into Shadowkeep, with a new Londo Ruins watery twist. There's a lot of back and forth between areas from this point on, and this was the last major bit of exploration that happened, so I'll conclude with the final fights with bosses in quick succession. I was still Scadu 15 for Commander Gaius, and killed him the first time I managed to dodge his stupid charge at the start of the fight, which was my 4th attempt, so only a few minutes were spent here. You get 5 fragments for beating Gaius, so I was DLC level 17 for Scadu Tree Avatar. This took me way longer at almost half an hour. I met Meteor shortly after this and got a very sloppy kill in under 10 minutes. Probably didn't deserve this one, but I didn't like the fight that much, so I don't care. Much to my dismay looking back, I had forgotten about Bale and Dre, and thought that burning Mesmer's Kindling for the final stretch was all I had left. So I did that, exploring a few side areas I had missed in Ra'a while I was there, and then cleared and near a limb, or Millie Rhine, as my brain insisted on reading this backwards for some reason whenever I saw it. Radon is the final boss if you didn't know. Spoiler warning was a while ago, to be fair, which made my choice of armor for this playthrough unintentionally very amusing to me. The crowd goes mild about this being a returning boss from the base game though, or at least I hope it does. Or maybe the crowd is going wild because there's nothing more Elden Ring than reusing unique event status fights from the base game, right? Everyone seemed to love that. As I said earlier, I spent 5 hours fighting this guy before seeing victory, even though I had reached Scatman 19 with a set of fragments from the last area. That's a pretty big bump in fight duration. Even Bale was a baby in comparison after this, dying in under 10 minutes, but remember, I had over an hour of attempts from earlier in the run that taught me a lot, so he still comfortably comes in second place for attempt numbers. He's in first place for my favorite of the expansion though, and in my heart. Good job on getting that if you guessed correctly earlier. That was my run of the DLC, and happily, all the major talking points I want to go through can be found in that summary. Nice that, almost like I planned it. Because I didn't. The 2 biggest problems I think FromSoft were facing when making this expansion were player progression and making an addition to the open world format. DLC for Dark Souls and the like has traditionally been a few more levels with a few more bosses. More of the same structure delivered at the same rhythm from the game's foundation. I suppose they could have done the same here for Elden Ring, but it wouldn't fit as well with the open world players would be coming from. Conversely, creating a second map that would be large enough to feel like you can get lost and explore, which is an important part of open world maps in my opinion, but still not balloon in size and outrun the scope into becoming a sequel instead of a DLC, would be a balancing act to maintain throughout development. And as we can see with the problems present in the game today, it was a difficult one to perform. Let's rewind for a second though. The answer to this problem is what we got, a mix of both. Technically, the Shadow Realm is an open world map, but to me it also feels like one huge open air Souls level. The legacy dungeon sections are more focused wings of this map, like dungeons within a dungeon, instead of the game's more sprawling and straightforward layout. It's a little more Zelda than base Elden Ring, and honestly is pretty damn close to how I envisioned the original game being. In my first video, I spoke about how I collected a handful of questions as I explored the game about unreachable locations, and wondering about them kept simmering as I made progress. Like getting up to this big plateau in the southern part of Liurnia. You can't get there until way later in the game. In fact, I actually had given up on being able to get there and thought it was just decorative in the distance, but then Elden Ring was full of surprises. The DLC goes ham on that idea, with main content being gated behind engaging with thinking about how to get around, which routes go where, and possible bridging connections on the map, instead of it being for mostly optional content in vanilla Elden Ring. This is probably my favorite thing in the DLC. It's either that or the boss roster of way more hits than misses. That's more of an enjoyable return to prom for me though, whereas this map design is something novel and interesting. I think it was a huge success in structure and rewarding the player with eureka moments, while also allowing the map to feel more substantial when it's quite a bit smaller than the lands between. It's a dense dungeon island versus the loosely interconnected continents. It gave me way more to think about and mentally work with instead of it acting as a hub for content. That's not to say that the base game is devoid of this. To be clear, some of the best parts have this same quality, just that it's at a higher concentration in the DLC. But then we have to speak about that content. First up, those Scadu fragments. How do you give players a way to continue leveling up when the majority of them will have endgame characters hitting the soft caps on many stats, have finished their builds, and therefore see runes as mostly worthless? Enter a new layer of character progression. Find these items, use them at a grace site, and get stronger on top of whatever power you came into the DLC with. Both damage and defense scale up with the same fragments, and spirit summons become stronger with revered ashes. So does Torrent apparently, but it never felt like it to me since getting comboed off the horse is the only thing that matters, and I don't think the revered ashes helped with that at all, but maybe I just suck. These two items are very similar to golden seeds and sacred tears for your flask in vanilla. They are similarly usually placed in ostentatious locations like they've been enshrined, but for the fragments especially, you can sometimes find them in more mundane places, or being carried by shadow dudes of no renown holding glowing pots, which is how I collected a few without even realizing. And I really don't feel like they should have done that, but you know, more on that in a little bit. There are 50 Scadu tree fragments to find, with the max level of the bonus being 20, so you very quickly need more than one for each level up of this Shadow Realm blessing. The strength of this has already been increased in a patch, so instead of giving solid numbers that might be out of date by the time you hear this, I'll just say it's about double damage dealt and half damage received at max level compared to no blessing at all. There are only 25 revered ashes to find for a cap of 10 blessings, but at maximum the buff it provides is comparable in power for your summons. That means there are 75 of these pickups to find in the DLC. How many lootables do you think there are in total though? Now obviously I can't go through and count them all to make a comparison. Exactly, I can't, so we'll just have to agree that it's a small fraction of the total things that you can find. There are quite a few new weapons and armor sets, but most of these will not be applicable to most builds, which means we have the first bit of returning criticism from the base game that applies to the DLC. Exploration rewards. I think this is the most disappointing aspect of the DLC, and it isn't just about items and character progression. The worst parts of Shadow of the Erdtree feel like the very best parts of Starfield, which is a comparison no one wants to hear. Empty locations and vacant stretches of land that commit the crime of teasing that they will be far more interesting than they end up being.
What experience led you to that belief?
Let's go in order here. Items fare the best out of these issues. Weapons and armor sets and talismans are fairly common, and even though they don't always have universal appeal, they're still more fun to find than low-level smithing stones and the like. They have the potential for unlocking new builds for future runs or tempt you into making a change for the DLC. Outside of that though, and where the findables bleed to character progression, is a missed opportunity for a new type of upgrade, an alternative progression path which at an extreme end could be like a much more in-depth and much more powerful Wondrous Physic Flask that I could ignore and then complain about my own choice for not using. But no, seriously, a new tier of weapon upgrades would have been great here, and a new level of Crimson Flask upgrades would have worked too. Maybe there were worries about PvP balancing or that a spike in player power would ruin the end fights of the base game, but they're bad already, and I think there could have been ways to mitigate that concern by putting limitations on the power buffs like the Scadu fragments work today. They only function in the Shadow DLC realm. It's a bit clunky, but if you're already in Clunky Town, then just kind of go crazy with it and build some more. At the very least, there should have been a new upgrade stone that allows you to improve any weapon in one shot from whatever level it is to level 25, or 10 if it's a somber version, as a cool new thing to find that also alleviates a lot of busy work in getting another weapon up to snuff. Some of these suggestions could have also been a part of breaking the endgame power boost of the Scadu fragments into smaller chunks. Like I said, the current ultimate bonus is about double damage, and I think it would have been better if a new tier of weapon upgrades and the Scadu boost still resulted in about that level of power. To reiterate, in this imagined different progression system, you would upgrade your weapon to level 40, say, with DLC stones, and when that's capped and you found all the Scadu clumps, you would still have roughly the same power output as you do in-game today with just the blessings. Just so there's more stuff to find in the world and you get to improve your weapons some more as well as your character, because right now there's just not enough of that in the DLC IMO. Personally, I would have preferred findable stat increases to unlock more build options and the like. Scadu Fragment of Endurance for 1 free point, Scadu Fragment of Dex, and so on. Maybe these even push the soft cap up so you can still improve your character in the stats that you like at the same time, and there could have been a lot of these to find because there are a lot of stats, and it would always feel like a little bit of cool incremental progress when you find them, but it seems like that suggestion wasn't well received from the first video, or at least didn't hit people as exciting enough. Who knows though, maybe people need to feel it to understand what it would do. One thing I feel way more strongly about, however, is that there could have been far more fragments to find, but this could be coming from a place of disappointment from my first run, something I think most players will share, which was that hoping that every lootable they found was the one thing worth finding and then being let down when it wasn't. Instead, this place is Gordon Ramsay's worst nightmare, a land where everyone knows how to cook. They could have doubled this number for the same boost in power spread over 40 blessings instead of 20, and I think it would have worked. Honestly, for the first time in my life, I'm trying to be conservative here because I think they could have went full Odyssey Moons with these and had one at the end of every side dungeon as well, but hey, let's not go crazy. My last point about these fragments is that I sorely wish they had been split into 2 sets, one for attack power and another for survivability. On my second playthrough of the DLC, I returned to my first ever Elden Ring character and switched him back to using a single longsword that I played most of the base game with at release, until making the switch to big weapons near the end when I got annoyed at the boss design. It was a really cool moment on a personal level for me to be able to switch that guy back to my favorite weapon, but we'll get to that a little later. I wanted to see exactly how many of these fragments I could get along with the new two-handed talisman at the start, and which parts of the DLC world were gated behind dungeons and bosses. Turns out, not much is blocked off. In fact, I think you can set up the map to have access to all of the major bosses simultaneously, except for Radahn of course, and knock them down in any order you like. Without entering any legacy dungeons, you can get 22 fragments. If you dip in and explore, but don't kill any bosses, you can get up to 36, which is enough to have the blessing as high as level 15 before you've solid snaked it up and fought any big boss. And this is also with me not looking at any guides for secret routes I might have missed, so it's possibly even easier to do than I think. To be clear, and I know I should make this kind of disclaimer more often, this is not criticism. Knowing the way on a second playthrough, so you're running around robbing banks all whacked up on Scadu snacks, can be a fun, perhaps broken experience, but is doubtful to be your first experience with the content. So it's a choice. But as I use these fragments, I desperately wish that I could have just applied the damage reduction to make fights easier in a way that made them more forgiving to learn and not accidentally blow my damage potential to the moon and burst everything down. Turns out my weapon for this run made that okay, but with the double colossal build, that was a lot of damage toward the end. I don't see a real downside here because it provides greater player choice and agency in character progression and allows the amount of fragments to find to be literally doubled since there would be the offensive and defensive variants. Who knows, maybe it would have allowed the defensive side of the buff to go even higher since boss damage can still hit real hard at the end even with heavy armor on. My other worry is how do you handle this on those subsequent playthroughs? It's very straightforward to collect all these, and it's not like boring time-invested grinding since you just go and pick them up. It takes minutes, not hours. It's like the trek down to Weeping Peninsula for the Sacred Tears and getting golden seeds in the open world, really. Imagine being able to go down there in the base game and then returning to Limgrave at level 120 or something. That's kind of what these fragments can do. It could turn into busy work at the start of runs or a test of willpower to keep yourself from exploring into a big bump in power, but also, is it? I don't know how to judge the balancing here, and I wonder if having more fragments all over the island would have made it easier to just go in whatever direction you like, zone by zone, and know you're getting a pretty even increase with each one. It still is a player decision ultimately, but it might be a difficult one to judge what's best. I also realize I'm kind of just describing a basic leveling system here, so I don't know. On that note, really though, this is a cursed problem and I'm wasting my time talking about it because I'm trying to stay focused on changes that are easier to imagine and implement. In reality, this needed a ton more time and attention from the developers and some big exciting shakeups. And maybe this should have been a separate game mode, or maybe the fragments shouldn't have existed at all and this should have grown into a full sequel. Because these two problems are the minor ones in comparison to the world just having so much damn nothing in it, and I am really curious how this happens. On the one hand, I highly doubt FromSoft was happy with a bunch of the side attractions they had in the base game. like the stupid turtle hunts, the Korok beetle puzzles, and the copy and pasted ruins. Apart from a couple of those beetles, these aren't back really, but there's nothing to replace them. Similarly, I criticized the ending of the game for reusing enemies too much, and for the final trek in the mountains, suggested that having straight up nothing there would have been an improvement for the mood and gameplay pacing compared to what they went with. The key part there, though, is what they went with. Unique, well-thought-out encounters with fresh enemies would have been preferable. With the DLC having so many stretches of actual nothing, I wonder if they had even more recycling at first and then took it out, or if new content just couldn't be made in time. Or the third option, they couldn't get it to run well enough. This is a much more layered map with more overlapping routes and intricate pathing. It could be that it was a performance problem on consoles, or even on PC. Todd knows the game isn't lacking those already, but my best guess is that this world was so difficult and took so long to develop that they ran out of time to properly fill it with stuff to do. Take for example that the expansion still manages to have so many moments of stunning beauty that you suddenly come across as you exit a cave, or follow a turn, or emerge from a building. From loves these scenic blasts, and so do I, so imagine how carefully the world had to be constructed through planning and editing to allow them to happen while also providing so much freedom in how the player gets around and explores, while also having interconnected routes going from zone to zone, or wing to wing if you subscribe to the idea that the island is more like a big dungeon than a hub world. All the while, these introductions have to be carefully, and naturally, hidden from the player's view so they still get the perfect shot with the title card as an introduction. Cerulean and Charos is one of the most beautiful double zones that From has made. It had a really enticing, infectious aura when I arrived there, going from the whiplash of repulsion from the mammoth dragon carcass to the alluring beauty of the contrasting flower fields. It felt like a reprieve from the rest of the DLC's mood so far, tucked away as far from the dying tree on the skyline as possible, and made me feel like I was back at the Fountainhead Palace in Sekiro. It was serene in that way. Yet this place is, now that's what I call Elden Ring, and crammed with the base game's greatest shits with little else. Another dragon fight, another mariner fight, another deathbird, demi-human queen, oh look a lobster, and there are the annoying hand enemies right next door. I'm not opposed to the game reusing these mini-bosses, since many players will be returning to the game just for this DLC, and might have the perspective of, oh yeah, those things, I remember those, sure I'll find another one of those. It's like everything is a remembrance boss, but when that's all there is, it becomes a problem for me. I don't know if that joke is staying in, that was really dumb. Unfortunately, this isn't the worst of it, because most of the northeastern part of the map frankly feels blatantly unfinished. The area around the church is the most forgettable part of the DLC to me, but that's only because the very last zone up here was so disappointing that I can't forget it. 2 more tree sentinels, another falling star beast, and the second middle finger ruins that go nowhere. This part, in the other finger ruins to the south, genuinely made me feel like I was playing vanilla World of Warcraft again right at launch and had gotten to one of the zones that didn't have content yet. And some of the bridging paths, when on Torrent, reminded me of the downtime in Shadow of the Colossus, avoiding the obvious pun here. It was such a disappointment to find nothing in these ruins. No secret, no underground legacy dungeons, nothing of substance to match the amazing mystique and the questions the visuals of these areas conjure, both when seen in the distance riding around and when viewed on the map. Nothing. Now let's couple this issue with how much of the baffling low-level drops you find as hand-placed pickups, not random enemy drops. Even the rune amounts are bad here. I would have loved this if there was a way to play just the DLC fresh with a new character from the title menu, but since that's not in the game, this is purely a negative to me. Even the justification of lesser stones being used to upgrade weapons doesn't fly, considering that you can buy them cheaply at the Round Table store. It's the clearest sign to me of all that they rushed in a panic to fill this world with things to find when they realized it was so empty and didn't have time to work on something else. Even the thing From historically does best, better than anyone, suffers. Enemy variety. There is so much reuse of the grave birds and blood fiends in particular, and not much diversity within enemy palettes at each zone. It was quite a surprise to see so much of the same enemy type spammed in some locations. Even the new world boss, the Furnace Golem, was boring to me by the time I watched a second one fall over. I love the visuals of these, but they are pasted too much around the map for how long they take to kill, and I don't recall anything else that was new trying to fill this field boss type of encounter. Let's pump the brakes here. That was 10 or however many minutes of constant criticism. Didn't I say this was my favorite DLC From has made? How can I do this in almost every video? Well, first, I'm the special type of asshole that likes to pick at what they love to make it better. thoughts and prayers to my children, I genuinely think good criticism is a gift to creatives, and I have benefited so much from it myself in this YouTube video work, streaming, writing, and so much more in my personal life. This isn't just dishing it out, I like to receive it too. And because of that, I know full well that I haven't always provided good criticism to these games. There are some parts in some of my Dark Souls videos in the past that I don't really like anymore. I've been learning as well, and it's a really good thing when you look back at your past self and see shortcomings, because it means you've grown as a person and can see those mistakes now, whereas before you couldn't. But pushing all that aside, this isn't me trying hard to find a flaw or nitpicking the game to a bald scalp. Speaking of bald, picture a man that has been killing it at the gym recently. Great workouts, nailing the diet side, sleeping well, the muscle like Winter, and Arnold is coming. Delectable shoulder work, impeccable chest progress, and arms to make another man tri-curious. But you know what he's missed week in, week out? His lower body. He has quads, calves, and hams that should be served deep fried at Popeyes. Shadow of the Erdtree is that. It skipped leg day. So while I can admire and enjoy so damn much about all of the greatness in the rest of the DLC, I can't ignore a part of it that does not match up in any sense of the imagination. Just like this envisioned bodybuilder having these really tiny legs with this huge jacked upper body that you can admire big time, but, you know, look down and it's like, hey dude, what happened? I think this is something some people don't understand about some of my past critiques on great games, and it must certainly be my fault. The incredible successes of them are the reason why the shortcomings are so glaring and sometimes unbelievable to me. It's like Shakespeare missing an opportunity for a pun, or Streamer Joe missing an opportunity to dunk on some weaves. Look, we're about to get into the boss talk, which is more positive than the rest, but I do want to make two final points about the DLC's world. The first is that, despite what I said earlier about its structure, I do think there's a lack of that Legacy Souls feel. Shadowkeep is great, but it's at least a full tier below Stormveil Castle and Lindell if you include the sewers, both of which were the highlights of my base game replay. The flooded section was a pleasant callback to Dark Souls 1, but then paid out very little in interesting exploration or even being an achievement to drain. You kind of do it really fast after getting there, with yet another reused boss as the key feature instead of something new and exciting lurking in the water waiting for you. The side dungeons were less frequent and more substantial, so a big thumbs up from me, but I don't know if they'll still be enjoyable on replays. Belarus was a pleasant introduction, but more so for atmosphere than level design, which is similar to my thoughts for part 2 of this later in Millie Rhine. Bad Romance Ruins was quite cool since it was a dungeon on horseback, and that's new and novel, but spent a bit too much time in the same boxy type of tunnels for my liking. And then we come to Midra's Manse, which had an amazing introduction, and then was teensy tiny. This is related to my second point. The overworld is very interesting, but lacks the surprises of the base game. The unexpected regions to the north, the underground map revelation, the meteoric change after Radon, the secret Sifra connections, and how the game feels like it could go on forever. And look, I get it, it's just a DLC, but it's DLC of more Elden Ring, and there is nothing more that screams Elden Ring than these sections in my mind. The Finger Ruins should have been this, but they weren't, which is why the Abyssal Woods is so relevant, because it's where Shadow of the Erdtree does come close. At some point in my exploration, I vividly remember thinking that I was seeing an empty area of the map when I looked down at this. Some inaccessible pit for lore reasons, how poetically apt for how I view the story of these games, with decorative foggy treetops that some other YouTuber will speculate on for hours. So getting here was a great surprise, made even better by what I think was a purely intentional misdirect of a side catacombs being the way you access it. The atmosphere is incredible. I love the gameplay jump scare of getting dismounted like a slap out of nowhere, and the twist of Torrent not coming back after that because he's scared, and then the disappointment cascade began. What are these tutorial messages doing in a secret endgame area in a DLC? Why is there a forced stealth section with enemies that don't look nearly as scary as the introduction here set up? Why is this it? There's nothing else. Two short, not fun stealth sections in a big, empty forest capped off by a small legacy mansion. Then when you're done, you still can't call Torrent to explore it properly because then you'd find out even faster that there's nothing here to see, except another 2 goddamn cookbooks that you have to hoof it around on foot to find, and it's not worth it and so drawn out and so tedious, and here I go, I'm sorry, I'm gonna stop. The biggest missed opportunity of the DLC, in my opinion, because the Northeast Zone and Finger Ruins were so lackluster that I can't even think of what they could have been, was not intertwining the outside forest with a supernaturally huge, twisted, Frenzy Flame themed mansion castle legacy zone, and I can think of no better fuel than this for a different fire. The DLC isn't finished, probably due to time constraints, and this vapid stealth section was a quick fix to fill up space that needed to be filled. This couldn't stay completely empty like some of the other zones. There is a boss here. There needed to be something on the lead up to it. I wish it was something more and more as I'm writing this, I wish this had been allowed to grow into a fully priced and fully developed Elden Ring 2, or Elden Ring spin-off. This world design deserved to be finished. And honestly, it still does, but I don't see From going there. Do you? I don't have as many negative things to say about the bosses, which is what we're finally going to speak about next, but first, if you'll forgive the indulgence, I have a feeling some people are going to skip to this section in the video timeline chapters, so give me a second to own them. Wow, so just jumping right here, huh? That's all you care about? Boss opinions or bust? Don't care about any of the context this section might draw from the rest of the video? I see boss in timeline, I get neuron activation? Go back to the start and watch the whole thing. Do not collect 200. In a weird mood for this one, sorry. It's going to get even weirder. Let me try to be really clear at the very start of this. I do not think that the problems that plague too many bosses in the base game have carried over or been made worse in the DLC boss fights. But I also think those problems are still present in the base game. I experienced them again fresh when replaying the game before the DLC, and after doing the DLC, I went back and fought some of them a second time, and I still think those problems are present. The DLC fights are a huge improvement. In fact, I think Shadow of the Erdtree has the best suite of bosses that From has ever made, and that might even hold true when putting whole previous games up against them. It gets a bit silly though because I have to break off DLC packs to do that. I think the Erdtree array is better than the spread found in Dark Souls 3, for example, but if you add Sister Frieda and Ring City's bosses to them, then that's now better than Erdtree's set, I think, if that makes sense. That's pretty high praise still, and I think it's justifiably earned. I didn't expect this to happen, and because of that, I don't quite understand the discourse around the DLC's difficulty at the moment. I wonder if the Spirit Ashes can somehow make it harder in a way, because the bosses have so many AoEs and big combos that can come out of nowhere, that if you have aggro split and you think that it's on your Spirit Summon and not you, you can just get wombo combo down to dead out of nowhere, so maybe that's where some of the difficulty talk is coming from. Or I'm worried it might be my fault a little bit, which is another reason I'm making this video when I really shouldn't be. It's similar to how people were speaking about the End Gauntlet in the base game. I agreed wholeheartedly with the majority back then, but this time I can't see those issues. Bosses are, by and large, exceptionally well animated for telegraphs, have clear punish windows in addition to opportunities to slip in hits in the middle of combos, and don't chain attacks forever in unclear ways. And even when they do have these big, long, spectacle explosion attacks, if you deal with them, they usually have a big punish window as a reward for getting through it at the end without getting hit, knocked down, and having to heal. I know many Elden Ring fans are getting angry that I'm still describing the base game bosses in a negative way like this, but just bear with me, we'll get to it, I promise, and hopefully we can find some middle ground. These 11 bosses felt like the best fights in Dark Souls 3, taken up a notch or two in complexity and dynamic reactions that still felt largely fair and reactable, all with Elden Ring's far better game feel for basic movement and attacks, plus the jump as a new addition for defense and offense. Then on top of that, the variety is here too. It's not just big armored guy with a sword, only the big armor is a bit different and a bit bigger, and sometimes the sword is a hammer or curved in another direction or has a little enemy dangling on the end of it, Artorias 3.0, 4.0, 12.0, and so on. They're visually and thematically fantastic and lots of fun to fight against. My least favorite fights of the main ones are Commander Gaius and Matir, and I don't even think these two are bad, just kind of meh compared to the others. Let's go through them one by one for some commentary, but we'll keep to at most one paragraph for each since we're already 20 minutes over time. I'm so bad at this. How long is left on the video? It's another 20 minutes after this, isn't it? The Lion and Rolana are the only two here that make me worried that I lucked into having a good time with them. For my first few attempts at Lion, I was thinking that all the comments I read about the DLC boss designs were right. It was a difficult boss to read since it's one of those FromSoft classics where the attacks are also movement, and so it can be hard to gauge. But it suddenly clicked with me and I was able to intuitively feel out enough timings that I could rumble with the boss and dance back, kind of like the corrupted tree beast things in the base game. I loved the design, the music, and the elemental switches as the fight progressed, and I hate that the boss was casually repeated in Ra Ra Ruins since this one felt really unique with its fancy cinematic introduction and everything. Not many bosses in the DLC get one like this, and yet this is the one that's repeated for some reason. There were camera problems on this fight though, and you should keep that in mind going forward. R'hllana also feels like a dancer, and I'm concerned that I would be whining about this boss if I didn't notice a jump attack heavy made my character stay ducked under many of her counterattack swings. Some good hitboxes on this fight. This helped me play aggressively, but I could be being too hard on myself here since I think I got a decent handle on how this boss would flow between attacks and still have punishable openings. I wish she had a better arena though, since she's better than almost every fight in the base game and is just in this room, hanging out. Oh, and if From is going to insist on putting ultimate lol killed you, learn for next time moves on its bosses when they get to low health, I hope they consider reusing Sekiro's life system as a way to smooth out what can feel like bullshit. It's not a big issue, especially since the move looks so cool, but it can feel cheap. R'hllana is also the boss that made me wonder about frustrations when fighting in tandem with spirit summons, because when I tried out my Mimic tier here to see how the DLC bosses handled them, it almost soloed it. I started to get really worried that I wasn't going to be able to fight this boss legitimately after this because, yeah, it came really close to killing it on its own. So I don't think the spirit summons are lacking power, it just might be that the boss AI doesn't really work well with them, especially when damage is tuned so highly. Maybe. I don't know. Ramana and Midra came across as the most traditional Souls bosses of the group, well-telegraphed attacks with a few delays and spell-based twists on that basic read and roll foundation. Pretty standard and enjoyable. I think they would have both fit in well in Dark Souls 3, in terms of mechanics at least. My only issue with Midra was that he could sometimes follow his huge frenzy ball nuke with the laser gun barrage right away, and I couldn't see he was charging it because the flames hadn't cleared yet. I don't like this kind of difficulty. I did like that you could see a path through the exploding butterflies that Ramana can carpet bomb the arena with if you want to get back in melee range faster. This was a cool test to read and respond to the situation going on. While Midra looked awesome and had a disturbing introduction, I do think they could have leaned into chaos more for this one, the arena breaking apart or moving to a different floor of the mansion, or a more explosive mini phase 3 near the end. Like maybe you have to burst him down in a panic before he explodes because he's the frenzy flame, whatever. I don't know the lore, but it seems like it would fit there, right? Putrescent Night is in a similar place, and also a familiar place. Madir is just around the corner, apparently. This is a very long drop as a tension-building introduction into a very large area, only for the boss to ride into view and make you squint in the distance. This is an unexpectedly small adversary that only gets bigger for a few moves, and even then, he's not really that big. It feels like a truly gigantic, monstrous Phase 2 is missing here, and considering how much the DLC does feel unfinished, I wonder if that was the intent, but I still like the fight a lot on my second time through. The double coordinated attack from both the knight and the horse was a highlight to learn how to properly punish, when the horse didn't spawn behind the knight at least. Jumping the fire was awkward, but I appreciated a slightly clearer than usual use of the jump for a fight, and its weapon was a fun nod to Orphan of Cause. Or some say Cosm. For a brief intermission, here are some passing comments on side bosses. I didn't like any of the phantom-like fights, and it's odd to me that they turned some invader encounters into rooms to find instead. The Death Knights were both pretty cool, and it was good to have these duels at the end of some side dungeons instead of a normal enemy with a boss health bar. It makes doing these dungeons again on a second playthrough a lot more enticing. Likewise, Monkey Enya, Blade of Curious George, was a fun surprise at the end of his dungeon. Jory, however, made me miserable, and as a melee build was the boss battle equivalent of trying to punch something in a dream. I do appreciate that it was a more in-depth boss at the end of that dungeon though, and maybe I was just fighting it in the wrong way and I'll have more fun on another playthrough later. At the risk of making the same joke as every other critic and reviewer, Mesmer is simply a mesmerizing fight. This is what Millennia should have been in my opinion. He even has his own firefowl dance that is better than waterfowl in every way, including the visuals. I feel like a king every time I dodge through this and then pause for the setup to punish it. His attacks are fast and varied and can be extended in ways that made perfect sense to me and never felt unfair. I also enjoyed that his Phase 2 was significantly easier than Phase 1 after it became comfortable. The boss has injured himself and tapped into some powerful force that, yes, looks insane and can deal a lot of damage, but that's come at the cost of Mesmer now being left open more often for big punish windows after utilizing this forbidden strength that he's clearly not used to wielding. I like that the boss had to go through that trade-off instead of just getting stronger in every conceivable way, period, and now you have to deal with it, good luck kid, and that meant the fight could front-load its difficulty without becoming frustrating in Phase 2. I am also stunned that these arena-wide snake moves became as readable and inherently understandable as they are after seeing them just a few times. Incredibly well done. I don't have much to say about Commander Gaius. I also don't understand what he's doing here. If it wasn't for the crappy hitbox on his charge, I would be lumping him in with Ramana and Midra as a decent standard fight. Kind of mid. On my second playthrough, I found the best way to deal with this was to get on Torrent at the start, right away when you go through the fog door, in order to outpace the charge, and then try to stay as close to him as much as possible after that, so he just can't do the charge again. When it comes to allowing Torrent to be used in some fights like this, I wonder if they really expect it to just be a way to move faster and then hop off while the enemy boss gets to use their mount for the battle. It works better in the Elden Beast fight now because you can close the gap between you and the boss when it just goes really far away from you, but fighting it staying on horseback the whole time just doesn't work. With fights like this though, Commander Gaius and Radahn in the base game, it feels so wrong and unintended to go on foot when the theme/visuals are screaming, mounted combat time, but without a proper dodge on the horse, it can be terrible to try it against a substantial enemy. Even the tree sentinels are pretty bad when fought on horseback. And the night watch guys that you can find in the base game as well. Another mounted enemy, and it's just better to use Torrent to get around and then hop off while they get to stay on their mounts. It just feels like something's missing here. Is it just me? Anyway, I like the absurdity of the full airborne dive bomb on Commander Gaius, and that's about it. Likewise, I have no meaningful commentary for Metyr. The boss is visually interesting in that grotesque way From sometimes does, but looking back, I think I was actually mad that this was all those finger ruins had led to, so I just unga-bunga'd it down. Sorry. Camera was bad here too. For Skadu Tree Avatar, this was inverted. I thought we were going to be able to get into the tree itself and climb around, and grace points were going to appear on parts of the tree on the map since it took up so much space stretching upwards. It was quite sus. It felt like the journey here was leading to that, and Avatar was the entry gate boss, but alas. Luckily, this meant I engaged with the fight properly and had a good time with this dragon that has been turned into a sunflower. Has big AoEs, smashes around, breath-like thorn conal attacks, and you are rewarded for hitting the head. Dragon fight. I enjoyed the twist of needing to kill it 3 times, and I think each phase is appropriately squishy to account for that. It also has some odd timings to learn that match its unusual visual design, and it's another boss I think you have to respect and play on its terms to learn to land headshots in order to enjoy it more. But you still have the opportunity to go in and hit the stem if you want, so it's not like you have to do that. I think this boss was great and could have easily ended up as a stupid gimmick fight in a darker timeline. Instead, it flourishes as a great alternative boss type from the usual archetypes that still functions as a normal fight. It was also nice of From to have Witcher music for this boss. Really makes me feel the overwhelming sense of dread about a ridiculously overdue project weighing down on the fight, just like the dying, overbearing tree above us. Next level gameplay and ludonarrative harmony here, 10 out of 10. Which means we have 2 left to look at. Bale and Radahn. Bale was my favorite, and spoilers for a few paragraphs from now, Radahn sits at the opposite end on the spectrum from him. Bale is the best dragon boss that From has ever done, and takes Missing Leg Day to a whole new level. Presentation-wise, this is like fighting a rock opera in a thunderstorm. It's undiluted awesome. The visuals don't have to carry here though, because mechanically the boss is also exciting and engaging. Bale is aggressive enough to not feel like an animatronic theme park attraction that you get to hit between his movements, but also not so relentless that it feels like he never stops attacking. Although there are some strings in Phase 2 that can go on for a bit if he decides to chain certain attacks back to back. It's never as bad as Midir, who had a habit of doing frontal rampages off screen, sometimes in close succession, or even one after the other, and you just had to watch, which I think I remember complaining about in my Ring City review. I still like that fight, but Bale takes the new Dragon Crown and shows a big improvement on From's part. Best boss of the DLC. This is an easy S tier, but keep the presence of camera issues simmering in the back of your mind for a while longer. Now, you can clearly tell from my footage that I did not completely master these fights, though I did come close to no-hit killing Bale and would have tried longer for that if it wasn't for 2 moves that I think are too frustrating to deal with right now, the sudden fire breath turns and the quick roar, the former of which I am convinced is bugged, but we'll see how it goes. I very rarely beat a boss hitless on my first or second playthroughs, which is what I base these critique videos on, because I don't think it's a good representation to do a big video on this when you've played the game for 1,000 hours or so. But an important milestone to me when it comes to learning fights is looking back at my time with them and thinking that I could beat them hitless or fully master them if I put in a bit more time to refine my gameplay. This is usually how I feel after beating a harder boss, oddly enough, since I have to learn more over many attempts so I can respond to almost everything in order to get a kill. Meanwhile, the easier bosses can just be burst down sometimes or fall over just after a couple of attempts, even with some careless attacking. Said another way, when I look over my footage and see my mistakes, when I got hit or missed an opening, I can say to myself, damn, I got greedy there, or I mistimed that, I know I can do better, by responding earlier, or using a faster attack on a punish window that I thought was longer, or using a charged attack when I realized the window can be made bigger if I sidestep instead of dodge, and so on. This is the process that I go through. This is why much of my praise of these bosses was samey. This is how Souls combat works to me, and these bosses are variations on that in the same way that an FPS can be boiled down to run, aim, and shoot. Your options are fairly limited, and the gameplay is the learning process of figuring out how to dodge, weave, and punish in the midst of the amazing, spectacular assaults that the bosses throw at you. One of the reasons why combat can still be so satisfying in these games is because of how grounded it is. We're a far cry from how mundane the player moveset was in Dark Souls 1, of course, but that core feeling of being a normal guy with normal moves who still somehow wins against all odds lives on in Elden Ring. We can supernaturally enhance our stats through souls and runes, but our real superpower is perseverance in the face of a much more powerful foe, and the ability, and some might say humility, to take accountability for your mistakes over many attempts and learn from them. Sorry, I didn't mean to become a poet there. I tried to give that up after high school. Speaking of accountability, this is tied to the biggest mistake I think I made in my first video on Elden Ring. I can look at my attempts for some of those bosses and have no idea what I'm doing wrong, even for some moves after I've killed them. And that specifically is the issue I have with those bosses. I didn't speak enough about this learning process being the thing that was too hard. I also didn't qualify that statement enough, and more importantly, I didn't give enough respect to speedrunners and challenge players. Honestly, I didn't think they'd care and know my critique doesn't apply to them and their approach to fights. I said this single line, "I know there is a way to do these fights hitless if you're patient enough." And I thought that was all that was necessary. Not so, not by a long shot, and I'm sorry about that, that was wrong of me. Let's circle this back and connect this point to the final fight with Radahn. I really liked phase 1 of this fight. I've heard this cross-slash attack combo is nigh undodgeable, and my experience was definitely in line with that, but he didn't do it that frequently on me, and I'm guessing it's bugged and hopefully will be patched later. He was a step up in aggression and damage from the rest of the DLC, and had a few moves that were tricky to figure out, but didn't take too long to get down. Then phase 2 happens, and we're snapped